For this episode of Scholar Talks, we will be discussing the progressive vision and presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Our guest, David Brown, is a professor of history at Elizabethtown College and the author of 9 books, including several I've read myself. The First Populist, The Defiant Life of Andrew Jackson, also A Hell of a Storm, The Battle for Kansas, The End of Compromise, and the Coming of the Civil War. And also In the Arena, Theodore Roosevelt in War, Peace, and Revolution, which is the topic of today's discussion. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute. I want to welcome you to another episode in the America 250 Scholar Talk series. So, David, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Tony. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I love the book. TR is such a compelling figure, Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, both just in his life, his biography, and also his very, very dramatic and sort of watershed presidency. I often say, you can't really write a boring book about Teddy Roosevelt, but you really have written a magnificent book, very compelling. I just couldn't put it down.
Well, thanks. It was a labor of love. The thing that's really interesting about Roosevelt, well, so many things, is that it seems like even in a fractious country, people on the right, people on the left, they agree. They're very interested in Roosevelt. They seem to draw, whether it's the same thing or different things, but they find the man compelling.
Oh, indeed, indeed, and in fact, that's my first question. So Theodore Roosevelt is a fascinating, as we said, a compelling character, compelling figure. Can you please tell us a little bit about his pre-presidential life? I know we could do that for hours, but if you could kind of summarize his early life, that would be great.
Sure. His father was from a Dutch Knickerbocker family, New York, um, merchant wealth. His mother was from a Southern family, Georgia. Roosevelt thought that he, in some sense, embodied the country because of that family background. He was old money, and he thought that public service was the great thing to do. And so, whether it was serving in the American military, whether it was serving the state or serving his local community at Oyster Bay, he believed that he had a responsibility as a member of the patrician class to set an example of civic virtue for his countrymen. And this is something that I think he shared with his class, the class he identified with, mostly through his father's line, but also I think through his mother's ancient Southern Georgia line as well.
Mhm. Right. And he had a pretty colorful early career in New York State Legislature and New York Police Commissioner, Governor. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that does stem from his sense of civic activism. He was once questioned by a college, he went to Harvard, of course, a colleague who asked him, why do you want to do this? This is this democracy game. It's rough and tumble stuff, not for men of our class. And Roosevelt said, you're either among the ruling class or you're being ruled. And I mean to be among the ruling class. And his service to his state and his country, I think, stemmed from this notion that the patrician class, their day wasn't done, not in the day of industry, not in the day of Gilded Age graft and corruption, but rather it was incumbent upon them to establish, to set a tone upon New York City, New York State, the Empire State, and then perhaps upon the country. So I think Roosevelt's activism as a progressive president actually stems from an earlier activism that comes from the same impulse, which we see in state and local government. He very much believed that members of his class had a lot to offer in terms of good governance. And he saw himself, I think, as something of a golden mean who could stand between the political right, which he identified in his own party as the old guard, and the political left, which he identified, as many did at that time, was socialism. And then there was the patrician class, the old money in the middle, educated to serve.
Hmm. Right. And one more follow-up, just because it's just so interesting. I guess he went over to Europe and Egypt as a young man, went off into the West, the Badlands, as sort of a would-be rancher and so forth. So he certainly liked, went out into the Maine woods in the wake of his father's death as a student, and just really seemed to embrace what other historians have called the strenuous life. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. This is the phrase comes from a speech that he gave in Chicago.
Hmm,
And it was the notion of, in an age of industrialization, where are we going to find challenges? Um, we don't want to become machine slack, machine soft. And so, as you note, as a young man, he was an inveterate traveler.
hmm,
When he went to the West and when he purchased a cattle ranch in the Dakota Territory, um, he was not just a gentleman farmer. I mean, he was, but he also really engaged in the hard work. The men around him, the locals, they were very impressed by this. And so when Roosevelt becomes a national leader, I think he brings that sense of, um, of getting up and being active and doing to the culture. And he'll read a book, a novel like The Jungle, the Chicago meatpacking industry, and he sees these cities and he sees how they're getting big. And he's wondering how all these citizens are going to have what he would call the fighting virtues, the
hmm,
martial virtues, the strenuous life. And so he wants to create opportunities, perhaps through national parks, for example, for Americans to go out and you mentioned the Maine woods, experience the Maine woods, experience Yosemite, experience the majesty of the natural environment, which he saw as an antidote to urbanization and industrialization.
hmm, hmm. Very good, very good. Great context from the 19th century. So in the wake of his participation in the Spanish-American War, we have this image of him as a Rough Rider, and then later on as president. What are his foreign policy views? What are his foreign policy objectives?
He was very much an activist. He was very much his own, not just president, but his own Secretary of State.
Hmm,
And I think that this also comes from his patrician background. He views himself as a man who was educated and trained. And as you noted, he went to Europe a couple times before his presidency. Um, he was brought up to have a broad, wide worldview. And
hmm,
so he thinks, and he's right about this, that he can converse with kings. He can sit down with Kaisers and have conversations. The great triumph of his foreign policy was probably conducting the peace, helping to bring together Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War, for which this man who was a war hero, this man who believed in the strenuous life, this man who could also have some belligerent overtones to his foreign policy, particularly in Latin America, he will win the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize, for
hmm,
bringing those two countries together. He was Roosevelt was a little bit upset that Woodrow Wilson, a college president, okay, that's fine, but Roosevelt got to be the American president during the First World War, and Roosevelt just didn't think that Wilson was up to it and thought that he was something of a provincial Southerner and lacked the pedigree, lacked the experiences that he had had. And Roosevelt, we know, will make connections with world leaders during the First World War, including the
hmm,
French leader Clemenceau. And Clemenceau will tout, that Roosevelt, though no longer president, should be allowed to come to America and inspire the American troops that are now arriving on the
hmm.
shores.
Very interesting. In terms of his progressivism, as you mentioned earlier, how did Roosevelt institute these progressive policies and expand the power of the regulatory state, the federal government's power of regulation while he was president?
I think his timing was very good. If he had been president, 10 years earlier, it might not have happened. Um, McKinley, the president, was assassinated. That was the third assassination of a president in the last, 30 some years. Congress had assumed quite a lot of power, in part because of that. So here's Roosevelt, who is seeing a nation which is struggling with industrialization, with urbanization, and there's a great public outcry for change. On the frontier, this would be the Populist Party, the farmers. In the city, in the East Coast, this would be labor unions, emerging socialist parties. And Roosevelt is able to appeal to middle-class Americans in saying that there are extremes that are out there. He said, when I was the extremes were um, the, uh, the fire eaters of the American South and those in the North that wanted to sever ties from the Union. And he said Abraham Lincoln was the golden mean. I'm not sure that was quite correct, but Lincoln was his beau ideal of a politician. So Roosevelt said, I want to emulate Lincoln, and I don't want the radicals who are promoting ideological change, and I don't want the capitalists who are egging on the radicals to have their way. I need to be the golden mean. And the
Mm,
public liked that, and the public accepted that, and I think allowed him to assert presidential power and increase presidential power, and to begin to build a regulatory state. It probably also didn't hurt matters that Roosevelt was not really a good Republican all the time. He regarded the old guard in his own party as kind of his opposition, his enemies. It wasn't so much the Democrats. The
mm,
Democrats, they were obviously the second party. Republicans were the first party. And the question is, who controls this party? And for the last generation, it had pretty much been Congress, the old guard types. Roosevelt uses his charisma and his popularity, and he was a very shrewd politician as well, to manage reform in such a way that the people, generally speaking, were behind this change. And the old guard had to more or less go along with it.
Right, and as a follow-up, as you bring out in the book, the 1912 election, right? He's sort of running for quote unquote third term, and he definitely breaks with the old guard, bolts the convention, the RNC, and establishes the Progressive Party based upon this new nationalism. So he seems to become, just more. Maybe a little more radical, but also, just leans in a little bit more on all these progressive reforms.
Yeah, in a way, it was the second time that he tried to have a third term because when he left the presidency, he essentially thought that with William Howard Taft, who he chose, Taft was going to carry off a kind of a Roosevelt third term. And Taft had sort of made gestures that he would do that. Taft meant well. Taft was a pliable individual, and when he was around Roosevelt's, he wanted to please Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt left the presidency and went to Africa, and Taft was left with the old guard, Taft began to lean in that direction. Roosevelt does become a bit more radical, and I think that he got caught up in the progressive movement. Um, and so, for example, when he began to call for um, uh, judicial recall and maybe make it easier to remove federal judges and perhaps who knows even Supreme Court judges, then that's when some of the old guard, including one of his very good political friends for a long time, Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, wrote to him and said, you know what, we're still great friends, but I had not realized how wide we had diverged. So I think a third term Roosevelt progressive presidency probably would have went for no more than 2 years, because by that time the First World War was underway, and then I suspect that not unlike a second Roosevelt presidency, with Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal comes to an end in parts because there's the global crisis of the Second World War, and to the extent that Teddy Roosevelt, if he had gotten elected in 1912, could have pushed through a new agenda of more aggressive reforms. I'm not sure that he could have gotten that through Congress at that time.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Good. So speaking of his presidency, how does Roosevelt view the presidency, the office, and how does he expand the power of the executive?
Yeah, so there's this phrase that we sometimes use with Roosevelt, the bully pulpit.
Mhm.
And That means that you're using the podium, speeches, your charisma to, in a sense, speak over Congress and the Senate and reach the people directly. I mean, now we have obviously social media. It was a little bit of a different game back then, and so he wants to use the bully pulpit to bring his case to the people. And in that sense, even though Roosevelt was a critic of the populist movements on the frontier, which he associated with William Jennings Bryan, farmer radicalism, in a sense, there was a populistic strain in Roosevelt, which is interesting because, again, he's a patrician from this great moneyed family in Manhattan, but he really knew how to connect with people, particularly with middle class audiences all around the country. When he would go on speaking tours, particularly in the West, very, very popular. And I think that that's also part of how he expands the prerogatives and the powers of the presidency. Um, he's not doing this in the name of the presidency. He's doing this in the name of the American people. And his popularity was such that even when the old guard didn't agree with everything, they really needed Roosevelt before his presidency and during his presidency, and even after his presidency, to campaign on the hustings for Republican candidates. And so that gave Roosevelt some leeway with members of his own party who might think he was going a little bit too far, but they could see his popularity and they needed that popularity to retain power.
Right. Great. So, coming back to our original question, so what was the significance of Roosevelt's life and presidency in war, peace, and revolution, as your subtitle points out?
So I think of Roosevelt as someone who really anticipates the American century. This is the concept that we begin to define in the 1940s because of the Second World War and where the United States is moving as a world power. But I look at Roosevelt, who made his name in a war, the Spanish-American War, that gave us the Philippines. And the Philippine War, which was fought in part during Roosevelt's presidency, that was the first of the 20th century Asian wars that the United States would fight. In the last 30, 35 years or so, we've known quite a bit of conflict in the Middle East. The 20th century, that is, it's the Pacific. And so when I think of foreign policy, and I think of the expansion, the emergence of an American empire, and then when I think of domestic policy, and I think of, well, what was there before there was the New Deal? There was this progressive square deal under Roosevelt. So I see him as somebody whose fingerprints are on American foreign policy and domestic policy as we move into the American century.
Right. I mean, you've certainly made a compelling case here, and in the book that he is a transformational figure of lasting significance in the 20th and 21st century. So, David Brown, I want to thank you very much for coming on to talk about Theodore Roosevelt's dramatic life and presidency as we celebrate America 250.
Thanks, Tony. Good to be with you.
All right, thanks. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out the other videos in our America 250 series and go to YouTube and click subscribe.